Thanks. I'm very happy to be giving the talk here today. So, I edit Vegan Sustainability magazine, and today's talk will be a little bit about, this is just a model for behavior change. So we know obviously we've got a red storm warning on the west coast today, and the patterns or the cause-effect relationships underlying some of these events. The systemic structures we'll take a look at today are things like subsidies that drive and restrict farmer behaviour in Ireland and in other countries. And underlying all of that are our belief systems. Sometimes people associate increasing eating meat with increasing wealth. It's considered a desirable status symbol. That's changing a little bit. And also our belief systems give us a lot of our energy for making change. So today's talk will look at these things. We'll look at the causes and extent of biodiversity loss, land use and climate change, and then what are the benefits, some of the benefits of plant-based agriculture. So we'll start a little bit by understanding globally a snapshot of what future's like globally. And then we'll take a look at if there's room for changes in Ireland. This is a model from Kate Raworth. She works at Oxfam with Donut Economics. The situation in Ireland is obviously very different from the situation in some developing countries. Like Irish people's emissions are about 80 times the emissions of somebody in rural Kenya. So in lots of countries, still, food, health, medicine, doctors are in very short supply, and in most parts of the world, agriculture is rain-fed, so changes in climate is very substantial. And then at the same time, around on the outer circle, we know now there are biophysical limits what the planet can sustain. So the outer limits is a model that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. That's kind of some work that Oxfam did. They just had data on the ones where you can see the orange pies. So food, obviously, some of the population are still going hungry. We know obesity is affecting billions of people, but also stunted growth and malnutrition is also affecting lots of people. So we know still there are social targets like the Sustainable Development Goals that governments are working on for another 10 years until 2030, that we're trying to increase that. The Sustainable Development Goals, they also try to make our impacts less. So it's very important to understand from an environmental perspective, climate change is just one measure. So climate change is there, so it's in the zone of uncertainty with increasing risk. With biodiversity, already we've broken through the limits and we're operating in an unsafe zone. Fertilizers have increased ninefold since the 1950s, and they lead then to runoff into rivers, into water bodies. So you have situations like the Baltic Sea being one of the largest dead zones globally from intensive agriculture in Germany and Poland. The one we hear about more is probably in the Gulf of Mexico, but then freshwater use. Now lots of major river systems like the Colorado, the Murray-Darling in Australia, they no longer reach the sea anymore because we abstract all the water flow in the rivers. Even the Ganges wouldn't get to the Bay of Bengal, except there's a Bangladesh-Indian agreement to keep the water flowing for Bangladeshi farmers. But the main thing I look at, I'll talk about for biodiversity is land use change. Now, why protect biodiversity? So that's a complex question, so I'm not going to go into that question in detail. Most of us don't realize that you know, if you go back to time when there wasn't complex life and there was just bacteria, then the atmosphere had about 20% carbon dioxide, and it was just tiny little insignificant bacteria who figured out how to do photosynthesis, gradually replaced all of that carbon dioxide, oxygenated the oceans, and then finally created oxygen in the atmosphere. So oxygen in the atmosphere is maintained by life. We know climate regulation, soil is a living, a very complex living system that we still don't understand. And then sometimes economists put figures on nature's contribution. But obviously, you know, if your oxygen is gone, you're not going to be worried so much about the contribution. So in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, coming out of NASA's experiments trying to figure out was there life on Mars, Jim Lovelock came up with a theory about that the planet, oxygen doesn't remain stable in O2 form, it's going to react with something else. So our system is a system that's far from balance, and it's maintained in that zone by life. So now that's studied under Earth system science at major universities. The influence on life on all our different systems is huge. So in the talk there's a range of TED Talks. There's some fantastic TED Talks out there just showing this complexity, you know, how trees use some of the mycorrhizae to transfer nutrients to other trees, you know, colony collapse disorder, what's impacting the bees. So there's a lot of really good information that we're starting to understand natural systems a bit more. So the WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, that's kind of that's the definitive kind of report on the state of biodiversity globally. And it showed just from 1970 to 2014, it's showing a 60% decline. So from 1970 to 2014. So that's in mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. So a 60% decline in the human population would mean 4.5 billion people would vanish. So now, of course, the COVID has killed nearly 3,000 people, and we see the reaction to that. So somehow biodiversity loss is invisible to us. You know, Rachel Carson, when she wrote Silent Spring in the 60s, she also commented that we're not noticing this loss. We don't notice now that there's no skylarks in Irish countryside. You know, corncrakes are gone, curlews are disappearing, and so on. Because each generation gets acclimatized to the new baseline, so it just shifts. And then these are the causes. So habitat degradation loss, exploitation is fishing and hunting, invasive species, pollution, and climate change. Now climate change is still not a major cause of biodiversity loss, but it's increasing. So the two main losses, so 2/3 to nearly 85% of biodiversity loss in all those areas is agriculture and fishing and hunting and trade in species. So if we can change those systems, then there's huge potential to restore land to nature. Now, we occupy now most of the planet. So only 16% of the planet's productive land is without human impact. So most ecosystems now around the world have been altered. So all the built-up areas, all the cities and towns and airports and playing fields make up just 1% of the land. All that world that we occupy is just 1% of the land. You can see croplands are about 13% and pastures around 40%. So I'm going to talk about, we're talking about plant-based food, so we talk about plant-based agriculture here. Um, so grazing is huge, and it's difficult to convey how inefficient it is. So basically that blue triangle, 40% of that also goes for animal feed. So, and it's occupying 50% of the planet. So we've lost about a third of our forest. Pre-1700 was in temperate regions, and these days it's tropical forests that are lost. Another surprising thing is that still today, small farmers feed most of the people in the world. So the industrial system uses huge amounts of land, huge amount of resources, but it only produces a small, because it then takes all of those food, all of that food that it produces, all the maize, all the soybean, all of those feeds, and it passes it through animals first, and then they're extremely efficient at converting that to slurry, but extremely inefficient at converting it to food. So so nearly all of the calories are lost. So still today there's about some of the text is jarbled. Still today there's, like for example in our country there's just 3%, 2 to 3% of farmers. In South Africa it's 50%, in Ethiopia it's 85%. And they're subsistence farmers. Mostly they're plant-based farmers because you get way more food per hectare out of the farm. And that's what grazing and cropland looks like. So you can see kind of the soy and the maize in the US, and then grazing. In India, it's mostly plant-based crops. In China, it's a mix. And in Africa, a lot of dry land pasture. So every different little context is quite different and has different political dynamics and so on. But so we've lost about a third of the forests, and we've lost most of the grassland. And sometimes grassland is more efficient than forests at carbon sequestration. So basically, when the ecosystems are altered, there's biodiversity loss. Okay? So in order to restore biodiversity, we have to somehow decide, we've learned to increase our power. We've become very, very effective. We've harnessed lots of energy from fossil fuels, and we've developed lots of technologies. So we're going to have to learn to restrict that. That's forest loss, what it looks like on a map. That's what it looks like converting forests to soybeans. So the wood is even just burnt. Now this is in South America, but this is not small farmers. This is industrial systems like Cargill and Bunge, growing soy for Europe and China basically. So it's large scale, so you can see it again on the map. So that's the Amazon basin. Obviously when there's political changes like Bolsonaro getting in, then it gets a lot worse, because there was a moratorium in the Amazon for sellers decided that they wouldn't buy soy from recently deforested areas, and then there was a significant drop in deforestation in the Amazon across a 10-year period, but it did shift the deforestation into other regions. So the meat consumption in Asia and in Europe imports about 40 million tons of chicken, is driving this. Now, beef is a huge part of this, and most of the beef in South America is for South American consumption. So then that could be an area, this is across the region, substantial changes. Now Brazil is still 50% forest. Ireland is basically 1% forest, with 10% plantation which don't behave as forests. And then for all these different products, Europeans are actually consuming large quantities of soy, but it's not the vegans and the vegetarians are consuming the soy. It's just consumed through meat and dairy and so on. So the social justice issues, could be another whole talk. Like there's in some of the countries, like in Uruguay, they've displaced smallholder farmers for soy. So now they're having food shortages in those countries because they're exporting the soy crops. So what impact has that had on our biodiversity? So we heard 60% has lost. So that's what it looked like 10,000 years ago. And then today, that's the human biomass, but that's our livestock biomass. So today, now this is just comparing us with mammals, okay? So humans and our livestock dominate in terms of wild mammals, and poultry also dominates. Is it going too fast or it's okay?
Yeah.
It's okay. Now in Ireland we saw that agriculture occupies 50% of the land globally. In Ireland it occupies 70%. According to the EPA, every 4 years they do a very good report called State of the Irish Environment. Only 7% has a good environmental status, which is the EU Habitats Directive requirement. So in Ireland, because of our history of colonialism and because of the intensification of agriculture in the 50s, we have very few healthy ecosystems in Ireland. So that's, you can see grazing, hill, for sheep mostly. Crops and horticulture, mostly we're growing barley for animal feed. We import another 5 million tons of animal feed. And we have 10% plantations. That's an Irish native woodland. So complex, deep-rooted systems. So sometimes the citrus fruits, sometimes they're carbon sources. They don't even have a net carbon sequestration if they're planted on peat bogs especially. So, and then they're harvested on very short timelines. But there's huge potential to shift land use in Ireland. So also with grassland, we have a monoculture of grassland basically as compared to, a native grassland. Native grassland are probably one of the rarest ecosystems in Ireland. This just shows here in the corner, that's the root system of that monoculture you just saw. And this is why native grasslands can sometimes sequester more carbon than forests in dryland forest areas. Because fire is an integral part of those ecosystems, and sometimes the woody matter on the surface gets cleared off. So that's just, I just went to Google, you just take any area in Ireland, it looks like that. If you go to France, Italy, it looks like that. If you go to Thailand, China, it looks like that. So we're converting on a large scale very complex ecosystems into very simple monocultures. And there's no space for biodiversity there except in the estuaries. So in the oceans, that's what it looked like, in the 1950s. That's fishing effort in the 1950s, mostly it was a coastal zone. Now, in the 1950s, already the whale populations had been massively impacted, but also since the 1950s, because we've stopped hunting whales, their populations have recovered, not to the same extent that they were, but some of the populations are really becoming very well established. So as soon as we stop the human pressure, there's huge space for recovery in many of the ecosystems. So that's what it looks like today. Now, globally, fish is very important for certain coastal communities. But this fishing on the high seas, mostly that's done by 5 countries: China, Taiwan, Japan, Spain, maybe Korea, I'm not so sure. So also in the ocean, there's not much wilderness left in the ocean also. So the fishing by far is the biggest impact on biodiversity in the ocean. So often, obviously, we're concerned about plastics in the ocean, but plastics doesn't register compared to the fishing industry in terms of impact in the ocean. And half of the plastics that are in the ocean are fishing nets. So that's how, that's how much fishing is done each year. It's quite wasteful because, in Europe, people tend to eat carnivorous farmed fish. In China, they use vegetarian farmed fish, so they're much more efficient. And bycatch, and then there's illegal and unreported fishing. So the impact of that is that the global seabird population has dropped by 70%. So sometimes that's because seabirds are bycatch. In the long lines in the southern Pacific, albatrosses are bycatch. Even off the coast of Ireland there's a huge problem with the Spanish fleet and bycatch. And sometimes it's just loss of their food sources. So now on land use and climate change. So the optimistic projections at the moment are showing 3 degrees of warming. So to change our systems, we know it's not going to be easy. But they're the numbers that the IPCC have at the minute. So agriculture, including the deforestation from agriculture, is 1/4 of the emissions. The food system contributes up to 37%. But still, land systems are absorbing about 30% of the carbon dioxide that's emitted, and ocean systems are absorbing about the same, and then the remaining 40% stays in the atmosphere, and then it builds up and increases the energy in the atmosphere. So Ireland is legally bound to a 30% reduction. So the Irish Academy of Engineering estimated it would cost 35 billion, and they chose not to look at agriculture for us to meet that goal by 2030. And our agricultural emissions, they're increasing. So that's what it looks like in Ireland. In the last few years, 2015 to 2017, agriculture has gone up 7%. The IFA have this MAC curve. They have a load of very detailed things that they say farmers are going to do. Our agricultural emissions will continue to increase. But also our transport, our energy industry is 19% of total, but as more wind is coming online, our energy emissions will drop. So sometimes you do hear that Irish beef is super efficient. Now, it is efficient if you compare it to Latin America, and that's just because our forests are gone, so they're still deforesting now, and also the stocking density is much higher here than it is in South America. But that's beef there on top, and this looks also at transport. Often you hear about local food is more important than reducing your meat consumption. But local food transport is just about 10% of emissions. For beef, it's about 2.5% of emissions. So animal products in general, they're just way more because of land use changes, the green, and then the brown. That's methane. Okay, so the ruminants, are the highest, and then you get down to fruits and veg down there, and it's much more. So 10 to 50 times lower than most animal-based products. So it's not like a 20% difference, 30% difference, it's 50 times lower. So it's a big difference. I'll just say this briefly. So that's a well-known quote from Alexander Fleming about antibiotics. Now, in 2020, the Lancet came out with a report on sepsis, saying now that there is 11 million deaths annually from sepsis, and it's become more deaths than cancer now. And that's what how antibiotics are used. So 70 to 80% of the world's antibiotics are used because in the 1950s they figured out that it causes animals to gain weight faster. So in Ireland farmers are administering 100 tons of antibiotics just for cheaper chicken nuggets and sausages. It's such a precious resource, to be squandering it like that. Now, you don't have to go plant-based to stop using antibiotics. Countries like Norway have drastically reduced their antibiotic use on their animal agriculture farms. So this was a recent report just showing that overall across the food system, the costs are actually outweighing the income. So that's just looking at those different costs, and that's the market value. So this then is a solution, in my opinion. So not just my opinion. There's lots of calls for ending subsidies for fossil fuels on the one hand. So subsidies for fossil fuels are about 5.5 trillion. Subsidies for animal agriculture are, just over 500 billion. Transition to sustainable diets, and then ecosystem restoration. So there are large examples of ecosystem restoration happening in places like China, in places like Ethiopia, and usually they start with just you have to stop the unregulated grazing has to stop first, and then the ecosystem can restore. But farmers are going to landowners are going to have to be paid for ecosystem services and restoration. So I'm going to skip that one. So why pay landowners? That's going to be a question. So there's loads of different benefits that we get from nature, from soil formation to culture and so on. And what happens when you stop doing anything? So this is a farm just west of London, 1,400 acre farm, and they were a beef farm, so they were in debt, and they decided just to stop farming. They didn't do any environmental restoration, and they just let it go. And that just took about 8 to 10 years, but the biodiversity that got returned there was huge. So that's being used now as a case study in the UK. So you can just see it takes a lot of chemicals and a lot of fossil fuels to keep land looking at what we're used to looking at it like. So that's what they have cattle on the land, much lower stocking density. They leave the cattle run wild, and they have stocked it with some pigs and deer as well. So today, because of the inefficiency of animal agriculture, we could feed 4 billion more people just from the crops. If we stopped giving our crops to chickens and cattle, we could feed 4 billion more people. And we could also return 3/4 of the farmland back to nature and population. So now, so that's possible. There's a huge amount of international focus on ecosystem restoration right now, and the UN has declared this decade the decade of ecosystem restoration. There's other people calling to declare the high seas as a marine protected area, and there's there's substantial moves also to establish marine protected areas in Ireland. Those 3 talks, there are 3 TED Talks on the just understanding the ocean. Sylvia Earle, she's head of the National Ocean and the NOAA in the US. So there are calls for establishing marine protected areas. Okay. So a plant-based food system eliminates industrial fishing. So communities in Africa that are dependent on fish to supplement their diet, they would see their diets being enhanced by that as well. So there are health benefits. I won't focus on those. So just 2 minutes just on the economics of change in Ireland. So it's possible in Ireland to transition, because beef and sheep farmers in Ireland are going broke. So if they could keep their basic farm payment, then for converting it back to native woodlands and native grasslands, then we could see change. Now, the CAP is under negotiation right now. It's 35% of the total EU budget, and believe it or not, 28% of the total EU budget goes to 0.6% of the EU population. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. And they are the people who have the biggest farms. So in fact, Prince Charles gets a 1.1 million euro check in the door, except for now he doesn't, because and in Ireland, most of our farms are beef and sheep farms. So dairy is just the green sector. Dairy farmers are economically doing much better. So beef farmers, that's the subsidy they get. Okay? It's 158% of their income. So they operate at a loss. They lose 5,000 running their farm in the year. So their income then is 8,000 euros. So if they stopped beef farming, and could keep their subsidy, their income would grow by 5,000 euros. Okay, and it's the same. So so on 70% of the farms in Ireland, that's the case. So you can see. So this is the cattle rearing. This is direct payments. So this is their subsidy, 13,000 cattle rearing, and now this is the income, cattle rearing. So this is from the Teagasc National Farm Survey that they produce every year. So there's big potential to change that system. Most people don't realize that farmers earn so little. You know, so 44% of farms are under 10,000. I'm going to skip that. If we went to plant-based food on about a third of the land, we could triple the amount of food calories we produce. I'm going to go fast now because. So I'll take 1 minute on this. So sometimes people wonder, can we grow plant-based foods in Ireland? So this is from the Central Statistics Office. This is the current yield. This was in 2017. Right now, we produce 10,200 kilograms of wheat on a hectare. But we only produce 260 kilograms of beef on a hectare. Just because the beef needs to eat the 10 to 12 tons of grass that's on that hectare. So we can feed one person on a hectare if they just lived on beef burgers. Or we can feed 30 to 45 people on a plant-based diet. So that just shows, this is in 1847. So in 1847 we had about 900,000 hectares of tillage in Ireland in 1847. Now of course you know that was just after the famine, so most of that wasn't coming to the west of Ireland, unfortunately. Right now we have about 350,000, so much less. So we have potential to grow crops in Ireland. So I'll conclude there. if we could restore our agricultural land to native woodlands and native grasslands, there is the potential to reduce our emissions by up to 50%, and it's not going to cost 35 billion euros. Okay, thank you very much.